At 11:15 on the morning of April 9th, 1944, Lieutenant Commander George Castleman stood on the bridge of USS Pillsbury, watching a German submarine break the surface 700 yards off his starboard bow. 10 months commanding a destroyer escort, dozens of depth charge attacks, 0 captures. The U-boat that had just surfaced was U-515, commanded by one of Germany's deadliest submarine aces. Werner Henke had sunk 25 Allied ships. Over 600 men, women, and children had drowned when he torpedoed the British troopship Ceramic in December 1942. Now Henke's boat was crippled, forced to the surface by hours of relentless depth charging from Pillsbury and her sister ships. The German crew scrambled onto the deck. Some manned their guns, others jumped into the Atlantic. Castleman's ship opened fire. So did USS Flaherty. Machine guns raked the submarine's conning tower. Rockets streaked across the water from aircraft circling overhead. Within minutes, U-515's bow lifted toward the sky. She slid backward into the Atlantic and disappeared. 44 German sailors were pulled from the water, including Henke himself. The task group had destroyed one of Germany's most successful U-boats. By every measure, it was a victory. But Captain Daniel Gallery, commanding the escort carrier USS Guadalcanal, and the entire hunter-killer group, saw something else entirely. He saw a missed opportunity. Gallery had watched U-515 float on the surface for nearly 10 minutes before she sank. 10 minutes. In that time, his ships had done exactly what the Navy had trained them to do. They had destroyed the enemy. But Gallery realized that if he had been ready, if he had trained boarding parties in advance, he might have captured the submarine instead. The intelligence value would have been extraordinary. German codebooks, Enigma cipher machines, torpedo guidance systems, acoustic homing technology. The Allies had been trying to crack German naval codes for years. A captured U-boat could hand them everything. No American warship had boarded and captured an enemy vessel at sea since 1815, the War of 1812, 129 years. The Navy did not train sailors for boarding actions. There were no procedures, no protocols. No one had even considered it possible. Gallery decided to change that. The problem was immense. German U-boat crews were trained to scuttle their boats within minutes of surfacing. They opened sea valves, they set demolition charges, they destroyed codebooks and smashed equipment. Even if American sailors could reach a surface submarine, they would be boarding a sinking ship rigged with explosives. The Germans would rather die than let their secrets fall into Allied hands. And the statistics were brutal. In 1943 alone, German submarines had sunk over 300 Allied merchant ships. American destroyer escorts hunting U-boats faced a simple equation: find the submarine, destroy it before it destroys you. There was no time for boarding parties, no margin for error. Every second a U-boat remained afloat was another second it could fire torpedoes. Castleman's Pillsbury was an Edsel-class destroyer escort, 1,200 tons, 3-inch guns, depth charges, and hedgehog mortars. She was built to hunt and kill submarines, not to capture them. But Gallery had given the order. Every ship in Task Group 22.3 would form a boarding party. They would train, they would prepare, and on their next patrol, they would try something the United States Navy had not attempted in over a century. If you want to see how Castleman's crew prepared for an impossible mission, please hit that like button. It helps us bring these forgotten stories to more viewers. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Pillsbury. The task group returned to Norfolk in late April. Castleman assembled his best men. He told them they were going to board a German submarine. They had 6 weeks to figure out how. On May 15, 1944, Pillsbury sailed from Norfolk with a new mission. The official orders said routine anti-submarine patrol, but Gallery had received secret authorization from the highest levels of naval command. Bring one back alive. The boarding party from Pillsbury consisted of 8 men. Lieutenant Junior Grade Albert David would lead them. He was 41 years old, a former enlisted sailor who had worked his way up through the ranks over 25 years in the Navy. He served as the ship's assistant engineering officer. He knew machinery. He knew pipes and valves and how ships stayed afloat. David had never boarded an enemy vessel. No one in the United States Navy had, not in living memory. The training began immediately after Pillsbury left Norfolk. Every day, David drilled his men on the fantail. They practiced climbing over railings. They rehearsed jumping from a whaleboat onto a moving deck. They memorized the general layout of a German Type 9 submarine based on intelligence photographs and technical drawings. The challenges were staggering. A surfaced U-boat would be circling erratically, its rudder likely jammed by depth charge damage. The deck would be slick with seawater and fuel oil. German sailors might still be aboard, armed and desperate. The submarine could dive at any moment, taking the boarding party down with it. And then there were the explosives. German commanders followed strict protocols for scuttling. The moment a U-boat surfaced under attack, the captain would order demolition charges armed. These were placed throughout the submarine, designed to detonate and send the boat to the bottom within minutes. The crew would also open sea valves, flooding the engine room and control spaces. Even if American sailors reached the submarine, they would be entering a vessel that was simultaneously sinking and rigged to explode. David's team had to work fast. They estimated 3 to 5 minutes from boarding to catastrophic flooding. In that window, they needed to locate and disarm demolition charges, find and close sea valves, and stop whatever other scuttling measures the Germans had initiated, all while navigating the cramped, unfamiliar interior of a foreign submarine in near darkness. The tools were basic: wrenches, flashlights, sidearms. There was no specialized equipment for capturing enemy submarines because no one had ever needed any. Gallery held conferences with his destroyer escort captains throughout the 3-week voyage. Commander Frederick Hall coordinated the tactical approach. The plan called for careful use of weapons once a U-boat surfaced. Ships would fire small-caliber guns only, enough to drive the German crew overboard, but not enough to sink the submarine. Aircraft would strafe the decks to prevent the enemy from manning their guns, but pilots were ordered to avoid hits below the waterline. The goal was to wound the submarine, not kill it. Pillsbury's role was critical. She would be the first ship to lower a boarding party. Castleman positioned his whaleboat crews for rapid deployment. The moment a U-boat broke the surface, David and his men would be over the side and racing toward it. There was no guarantee the plan would work. The Navy had never attempted anything like this. Intelligence suggested that German crews could complete scuttling procedures in under 4 minutes. If David's team was even 30 seconds too slow, they would go down with the submarine. The task group sailed south toward the Cape Verde Islands off the west coast of Africa. Intelligence reports indicated U-boat activity in the shipping lanes. Guadalcanal's aircraft flew constant patrols, searching for periscopes and snorkel masts. Days passed without contact. The men grew restless. David continued drilling his boarding party, but the repetition wore on them. They had memorized every procedure. They had rehearsed every scenario. Now, they simply waited. On the morning of June 4, 1944, the task group was 150 miles west of Cape Blanco. Gallery had ordered a course change to head for Casablanca to refuel. The patrol seemed finished. At 11:09, the sonar operator aboard USS Chatelaine reported contact. Bearing 045, range 800 yards. A submarine was running submerged directly toward the carrier Guadalcanal. David's team had trained for 6 weeks. Now they had minutes. Chatelaine turned hard to starboard and accelerated toward the contact. 2 FM-2 Wildcat fighters from Guadalcanal dove toward the sea, their pilots spotting the dark shape of a submarine running just below the surface. They opened fire with their machine guns, stitching lines of spray across the water to mark the position for the destroyers below. At 11:16, Chatelaine released her first pattern of depth charges. The explosion sent white columns of water erupting skyward. Oil bubbled to the surface. The submarine was hit. 6.5 minutes after the first attack, the U-boat broke the surface 700 yards from Chatelaine. She came up bow first, her gray hull streaming seawater, her conning tower scarred with rust. The depth charges had jammed her rudder. Her lights were out. Seawater poured through cracked pipes in her engine room. The submarine began circling to starboard at 5 or 6 knots, unable to steer. German sailors scrambled through the hatches onto the deck. Some tried to reach their deck guns. Chatelaine and the other escorts opened fire with everything that would bear. Machine gun rounds sparked off the conning tower. A German sailor fell dead on the deck. The rest threw up their hands and began jumping into the Atlantic. On Pillsbury's bridge, Castleman watched the submarine spiral through the water. This was the moment. He gave the order to lower the whaleboat. David and his 8-man team were already waiting. They dropped into the boat and cast off, the coxswain steering directly into the submarine's circling path. The U-boat was still moving, still turning. They would have to intercept it like chasing a wounded animal. The whaleboat cut inside the submarine's arc. The men could see the gray hull looming larger with each second. Oil slicked the water around them. German sailors thrashed in the waves nearby, shouting and waving for rescue. David ignored them. His focus was the submarine. The whaleboat pulled alongside. The hull was slick with oil and seawater. David grabbed a railing and pulled himself onto the deck. His men followed. The submarine rolled beneath their feet, still circling, still sinking by the stern. One German body lay face down near the conning tower hatch. No other enemy sailors were visible. David did not hesitate. He climbed through the hatch and dropped into the control room. The interior was nearly dark. Emergency lighting cast red shadows across unfamiliar machinery. Water sprayed from broken pipes. The deck was tilted at an angle. The submarine was flooding. David could hear the rush of seawater somewhere below. The Germans had opened the sea valves before abandoning ship. He had minutes, maybe less, before the boat went down. His men spread through the compartments. One found the sea strainer valve, a large pipe allowing ocean water to flood the bilges. The cover had been removed and thrown aside. He located it nearby and screwed it back into place. The flooding slowed. Others searched for demolition charges. They found 13 throughout the submarine, placed in the engine room, the torpedo compartments, the control spaces. Each one had to be located, examined, and disarmed. The charges had timers. Some were set to detonate within minutes. David's team worked in near darkness, crawling through oily water, tracing unfamiliar pipes and cables. They pulled wires. They removed detonators. They sealed valves and hatches. The submarine continued to settle by the stern, her aft deck already submerged. Above them, the circling submarine posed a new danger. Without steering, the U-boat swung toward Pillsbury herself. Castleman had to maneuver his ship to avoid collision. The whaleboat that had delivered David's team was crushed between the two hulls. 3 of Pillsbury's compartments flooded from the impact, but the boarding party stayed aboard the submarine. They had stopped the scuttling. The U-boat was wounded, but she was not sinking. At 11:30, a second boarding party arrived from Guadalcanal, led by Commander Earl Trocino, the carrier's chief engineer. He found David's men still working in the flooded compartments, still pulling demolition charges from hidden corners. They had captured a German submarine. Now they had to keep her afloat. Commander Trocino crawled through the flooded compartments for hours. He was a merchant marine engineer before the war, experienced with ship's systems and machinery, but he had never been inside a German submarine. No American had. The Type 9 U-boat was larger than he expected, over 250 feet long, 11 compartments connected by watertight hatches. The design was foreign, the labels in German, the equipment unfamiliar. Trocino traced pipelines by hand, following them through the oily bilge water until he understood how the submarine's systems connected. The stern was already underwater. The depth charge damage had cracked pipes and ruptured tanks throughout the aft section. Seawater continued to seep in through dozens of small leaks. If they could not stop the flooding, the submarine would sink within hours. Trocino organized the salvage effort. He directed men to specific valves. He identified which pumps still functioned. He jury-rigged connections between compartments to redirect the flow of water. Slowly, the flooding stabilized. While Trocino worked on keeping the submarine afloat, David's team collected intelligence materials. They found 2 Enigma cipher machines intact, complete with their coding rotors. They gathered stacks of code books, signal documents, and operational orders. They located charts showing U-boat patrol zones across the Atlantic. 900 pounds of classified German naval documents. The haul was extraordinary. Allied codebreakers at Bletchley Park in Britain had been working to crack German naval communications for years. They had achieved partial success, but the Germans regularly changed their cipher settings. Fresh codebooks and an intact Enigma machine could unlock months of intercepted messages. But there was more. In the forward torpedo room, the salvage teams found 2 acoustic homing torpedoes. The Germans called them Zaunkönig. The Allies had heard rumors of these weapons, but had never examined one. The torpedoes used sound to track their targets, homing in on the propeller noise of Allied ships. Understanding how they worked could save hundreds of lives. Captain Gallery faced an immediate problem. His task group was now responsible for a captured enemy submarine 150 miles off the African coast. The U-boat could not move under her own power. She was barely staying afloat, and 3,000 American sailors had just witnessed her capture. If the Germans learned that U-505 had been taken intact, they would change their codes immediately. Every advantage gained from the captured materials would vanish. The entire operation would be worthless. Gallery ordered absolute secrecy. No radio transmissions about the capture. No written records in ship logs. The German prisoners, 58 men including their wounded captain, were confined below decks on Guadalcanal, forbidden from speaking with anyone. Then, Gallery received new orders from Washington. The original plan had been to tow the submarine to Casablanca. Now, he was directed to take her to Bermuda instead. 2,500 miles across the open Atlantic. The timing was critical. Allied forces were about to invade Normandy. D-Day was scheduled for June 5th, pushed to June 6th due to weather. If German intelligence discovered that their codes had been compromised days before the largest amphibious invasion in history, the consequences could be catastrophic. Pillsbury attempted to take the submarine under tow, but the collision during the capture had damaged her hull. 3 compartments were flooded. She could not maintain the strain. Guadalcanal herself rigged a tow line from the carrier to the U-boat and began the slow journey north. The voyage took 15 days. Storms threatened to swamp the waterlogged submarine. Salvage crews remained aboard around the clock, pumping water and monitoring leaks. The fleet tug USS Abnaki eventually took over towing duties, but the danger never lessened. On June 19th, the task group entered Port Royal Bay, Bermuda. The U-boat was immediately hidden in a remote corner of the naval base. She was repainted to disguise her German origins and given a new designation, USS Nemo. The 58 German prisoners were transferred to a secret camp in Louisiana. The Red Cross was denied access. Their families in Germany received notifications that they were missing, presumed dead. They would not learn the truth until 1947. Admiral Ernest King, Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet, reviewed the intelligence haul. The codebooks alone were invaluable, but King had another concern. Gallery had taken an enormous risk. If the capture had failed, if the Germans had learned their codes were compromised, the damage to Allied operations could have been incalculable. The Admiral's response was measured. Gallery would receive the Legion of Merit, but he would also receive a private warning. The secrecy had to hold. If it did not, there would be consequences. The German Navy never learned what happened to U-505. Admiral Karl Donitz, commander of the U-boat fleet, received the final transmission from the submarine on June 3rd. She reported her position off the African coast and indicated she was returning to base in Lorient, France. After June 4th, silence. This was not unusual. U-boats disappeared constantly in 1944. Allied hunter-killer groups and long-range aircraft had turned the Atlantic into a killing ground for German submarines. Donitz assumed U-505 had been sunk by depth charges or aerial attack, like hundreds of others before her. He ordered no changes to German codes. He issued no warnings about compromised communications. The Kriegsmarine continued using the same Enigma settings, the same cipher procedures, the same operational protocols. The secrecy held. 3,000 American sailors who had witnessed the capture said nothing. They wrote no letters home describing what they had seen. They made no mentions in personal diaries. Captain Gallery had explained the stakes during the voyage to Bermuda. If word reached the Germans, the intelligence value would be destroyed. Allied sailors and soldiers would die because of loose talk. The men understood. Not a single breach occurred. At Bletchley Park in England, British codebreakers received the captured materials within weeks. The Enigma machine and its rotors confirmed their understanding of German cipher methods. The codebooks provided settings valid through the summer of 1944. Intercepted U-boat transmissions that had been gibberish suddenly became readable. The intelligence revealed German submarine positions across the Atlantic. It exposed patrol patterns and attack strategies. It identified supply routes and rendezvous points. Allied convoy commanders adjusted their courses to avoid known U-boat concentrations. Hunter-killer groups received precise coordinates for their targets. The acoustic homing torpedoes proved equally valuable. American engineers at the Naval Ordnance Laboratory in Washington disassembled the Zonkonig weapons and analyzed every component. They discovered the torpedoes tracked the cavitation noise created by ship propellers. Within months, the Navy developed countermeasures. Ships began towing noisemakers called foxers, decoys that produced louder cavitation sounds than the ships themselves. The torpedoes chased the decoys instead of their intended targets. German U-boat commanders noticed the change. Their acoustic torpedoes, which had been devastating Allied escorts, suddenly missed with alarming frequency. They reported the failures to headquarters. Dönitz suspected the Allies had developed some form of countermeasure, but he never connected it to U-505. He assumed the technology had been captured from a torpedo that failed to detonate, not from a submarine taken intact. The war in the Atlantic continued through the summer and fall of 1944. U-boat losses mounted. New submarines left German shipyards equipped with snorkels, devices that allowed them to run their diesel engines while submerged. The technology extended their underwater endurance and made them harder to detect. But the Allies had the codes. They knew where the new submarines were going before they arrived. Hunter-killer groups intercepted them in mid-ocean. Aircraft caught them during surface transits. The Battle of the Atlantic, which had threatened to strangle Britain's supply lines for 4 years, was effectively won. Pillsbury returned to operations after repairs in Norfolk. The collision with U-505 had damaged 3 compartments, but the shipyard crews restored her within weeks. By late summer, she was back on patrol with Task Group 22.3. The Hunter-Killer Group continued sweeping the Atlantic through the fall. They found no submarines. German U-boat activity had collapsed in the Central Ocean. The few boats still operating hugged the European coastline or lurked in distant waters where Allied air cover was thin. The war in Europe approached its end. By April 1945, Allied armies had crossed the Rhine and were driving into Germany. The Soviet forces closed on Berlin from the east. Hitler's Reich was collapsing. But the U-boat war was not finished. German Naval Command had one final operation planned. A group of submarines equipped with the latest technology would cross the Atlantic and strike the American coast. The mission was desperate, a last attempt to prove that Germany could still threaten the enemy homeland. On April 8, 1945, Pillsbury sailed from Norfolk as part of a new task group. Their mission was to intercept the incoming submarines before they reached American waters. The operation was called Teardrop. Operation Teardrop was born from fear. Allied intelligence had detected a group of German submarines heading west across the Atlantic in early April 1945. The boats were Type 9 long-range submarines capable of reaching the American coastline. But what alarmed naval planners was the cargo they might be carrying. Rumors had circulated for months about German plans to launch V-1 flying bombs or V-2 rockets from submarine platforms.